Imagine this. It's July 4th, 1187. We're looking at a supposedly invincible Crusader army, and they are suddenly trapped in a literal, blistering hellscape at the Horns of Hattin. This right here is one of the most devastating military traps in human history, all orchestrated by a man who became an absolute legend.
Picture the scene. It's the dead of summer in the Middle East. You've got thousands of Christian knights decked out in thick, heavy iron armor, which honestly is pretty much the worst possible fashion choice for the desert in July. That armor is basically turning into a wearable oven. And to make matters even worse, Muslim forces have literally set fire to the dry desert brush all around them. So these knights are choking on thick smoke, the wind is just blasting blistering heat right into their faces, and they're completely encircled with zero access to water.
So you've really got to ask yourself, how did this happen? How does a massive, heavily fortified and well-supplied Crusader army walk into such a catastrophic and, frankly, totally avoidable trap? Well, to understand how the brilliant Sultan Saladin engineered this absolute masterstroke of military strategy, we actually have to hit rewind and flash back 88 years.
Section 1. The Crucible of 1099.
You really can't grasp the magnitude of Saladin's victory without understanding the profound trauma that came before it. See, it took almost 9 decades for the Muslim world to recover from what went down in 1099. That was the year the First Crusade, which was kicked off by Pope Urban II, violently breached the walls of Jerusalem, and what followed was a horrific bloodbath. The historical accounts from that time are just brutal, describing streets literally knee-deep in blood and a massive massacre at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And out of all that violence, 4 heavily fortified Crusader states dug their heels into the region: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, and Edessa.
Now, the core dynamic of this era boils down to one absolutely massive contrast. The Crusaders didn't just stick around because of their military might or those giant stone fortresses. They survived and even thrived because the surrounding Muslim emirates in Syria, Egypt, and Iraq were totally fractured. We're talking about small, warring factions that were way more obsessed with fighting each other for internal power and protecting their own little thrones than unifying against the Crusaders. It was a classic case of divide and conquer.
Section 2. Saladin's Iron Noose.
Right into the middle of this chaotic, divided landscape steps a leader who completely flips the board, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to the West as Saladin. He realized pretty early on that just throwing troops at massive stone walls was strategic suicide. His real weapon? Unity. So step 1, in 1169, through some incredibly smart political maneuvering, he becomes the Vizier of Egypt. That ends the weak Fatimid rule and brings all of Egypt under his banner. Then, after the Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din passes away, Saladin systematically takes over Damascus, then Aleppo, and eventually absorbs Mosul. And that right there is his masterstroke. It's known as the Iron Noose. He literally wraps around the Crusader states, cutting them off on 3 sides: north, south, and east.
Section 3. The Spark of War.
Even with that overwhelming geographic advantage, Saladin was surprisingly patient. He actually maintained a fragile truce with the leper king of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV. But, peace never lasts long, right? It was completely shattered by one rogue, fanatic Crusader knight named Raynald of Shadian. Raynald was essentially acting like a warlord out of the Kerak fortress. He totally ignored the peace treaty, relentlessly attacking these peaceful Muslim trade caravans down in the Red Sea. And then he showed the ultimate arrogance. He actually threatened to march on the holy cities of Mecca and Medina to destroy the prophet's tomb. That was the final straw. It pushed Saladin, who was famously known for his calm, calculated demeanor, to make a solemn, very personal vow. He swore he would kill Raynald with his own hands.
Section 4. The Trap of Hattin.
Okay, so fast forward to 1187. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had fallen under the control of a rather weak puppet king named Guy of Lusignan. Saladin knows he can't just casually knock down the massive walls of Jerusalem, so he decides to lure their 20,000-strong field army out into the open. And the way he layers this trap is just masterful. First, he besieges the town of Tiberias, purely as bait. Now, the experienced Crusader knights, guys like Count Raymond, they literally begged King Guy not to take the bait. They knew that marching a heavily armored army across a dry desert in the middle of July was straight-up suicide. But King Guy, who was heavily manipulated by arrogant knights like Raynald, decided to march out anyway, and the trap springs. Saladin's light cavalry immediately starts harassing them. They slow the Crusaders down, completely block their path to the fresh water of the Sea of Galilee, and then, as a finishing touch, they set the surrounding desert brush on fire.
And talk about psychological dominance. While the Crusaders are out there literally dying of thirst on the hills of Hattin, Saladin does something unbelievable. He has his troops bring up thousands of gallons of fresh water from the Sea of Galilee on camels, and they deliberately pour it out into the dry sand, right in front of the parched Crusaders. Just imagine that. It completely, utterly shattered whatever morale they had left. The Crusader field army was entirely annihilated, and the holy relic they brought with them, the true cross, was captured.
Right after the battle, the surviving captive leaders are brought into Saladin's tent. And here we see this really fascinating contrast in leadership and honor. Saladin actually offers King Guy a cup of iced water. Guy takes a drink, but then he hands the cup over to Reynold. Now, by traditional Arab custom, if you give a prisoner food or drink, you're essentially guaranteeing their life. Saladin immediately shuts this down. He makes it crystal clear that he did not offer that drink to Reynold. True to his vow, Saladin deals justice to the treaty breaker, executing Reynold himself. But when it comes to King Guy, he shows mercy, delivering that famous historical line, "A king does not kill a king."
Section 5. The Liberation of Jerusalem. So, with the Crusader field army completely wiped out, Saladin systematically captures the coastal cities to cut off any European naval reinforcements. Then, he arrives at the walls of Jerusalem. The commander inside, Balian of Ibelin, knows it's over. He threatens that if Saladin attacks, the Christians will just destroy the city themselves, burn their own wealth, and demolish the Islamic holy sites, including the Dome of the Rock. Now think about this. Saladin absolutely had the military power to take the city by force and avenge that horrific massacre of 1099. But instead, he chooses a path that is incredibly rare in military history: absolute mercy. He agrees to a peaceful surrender, he explicitly forbids his soldiers from taking any revenge, he protects all the holy sites, and he allows the Christians to ransom themselves. And for the thousands of poor citizens who couldn't afford their own ransom, Saladin and his brother al-Adil actually paid for their freedom out of their own personal pockets. Seriously, how often does that happen?
Section 6. The Third Crusade and a Mortal Legacy.
The news of Jerusalem falling back into Muslim hands sent absolute shockwaves across Europe. Legend actually has it that the Pope literally died of a heart attack when he heard the news. This event triggers Europe's mightiest monarchs to launch the massive Third Crusade. You've got England's King Richard the Lionheart, who was a phenomenal tactician in his own right, winning some early battles at Arzuf and Jaffa. But Saladin is smart. He doesn't take the bait for a suicidal final clash. Instead, through sheer strategic patience, scorched earth tactics, and relentless guerrilla warfare, he just bogs Richard down. Eventually, the Crusader supplies dwindle, and Richard is forced to head back to Europe. This whole standoff culminates in the Treaty of Ramla. It was a brilliant compromise that kept Jerusalem under Muslim control, but firmly guaranteed that unarmed Christian pilgrims could visit their holy sites freely and safely. And that leaves us with a really fascinating takeaway. Today, Saladin's campaigns, especially that brilliant trap at Hattin, are still studied in military academies all over the world as absolute masterclasses in strategic encirclement. But his legend isn't just about outsmarting the Crusaders. He proved that supreme power and military genius absolutely do not require you to sacrifice your humanity. History is full of ruthless conquerors, right? But how often do we see a victor immortalized for their profound mercy? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope you found this deep dive as fascinating as I did.